Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, but this week we have a special guest, and that's actually me. I brought Jason Perez on the show to interview me. How you doing, Jason?
Hey, yo, my peoples, what's up? This is the Beyond Solitaire podcast, but for one episode, we are going to turn the tables.
Yeah, and I just want to explain really quick. The reason that we are doing this is that this is the last episode of my second season. So after this I'm going to take a little bit of a break, and we are going to come back when I have some new good interviews cooked up. But for now, Jason, it's all you.
Okay, so welcome to the Beyond Solitaire podcast. I am stepping in because Liz and I are gaming besties, and we have interviewed many people, so we're practiced at this, so to speak. So the idea and what Liz wanted to do, and this was Liz's idea. Liz wanted to have an episode where it was a little bit reflective, talking about the podcast, where it's been, where it's going, why it's there in the first place. And so rather than a monologue, I'd suggest it's like, I'm not doing nothing. It's 8 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, and I just need to splash some water on my face and put on the old interview hat. And why don't I interview you? And Liz, seems like you thought that was a good idea.
Definitely. You're the only person I trust to interview me. No, it's actually true. But I love chatting with you and reflecting with you about things. It seemed like a perfect match.
All right, so we are going to. Imagine everybody out in listener land. Usually, Liz is behind the desk. Let's say this is like the Tonight Show. Liz is behind the desk, and the guest is on the couch. We are now going to do the giant switcheroo. I am going to stand up and sit behind the desk, and now Liz is going to take her place on the couch, and we are going to interview Liz. Hi, Liz. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Happy to be here. How are you?
You don't get to ask that. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm all good. I'm ready to go. Let's do this. All right. The point of this episode is, like I said before, a reflection, but not necessarily kind of your gamer origin story. I feel like that's out there. Like you've done a lot of guest spots on different podcasts, and so you've been on Sporadically Bored and Five Games for Doomsday, and a lot of different shows. So I feel like we've gotten a sense of your origin story. Um, but I wanted to kind of pay forward a little bit and kind of talk about Beyond Solitaire, the channel, and especially the podcast. You have clearly devoted a lot more of your energy, or a greater share of your energy, to this podcast, which is, going pretty strong. You have very interesting guests. So I thought it would be interesting to begin by kind of reflecting on how the podcast has developed. What was your original vision for the podcast, and have you realized that vision? So that's a big question. So let's start with, when you started the Beyond Solitaire podcast, what was your vision for it first, on the first idea when you started it?
So, what's interesting is one of the reasons I wanted to do this reflection is that I'm not sure I had a very cohesive vision, but I had a really strong desire to do it. And sometimes when my gut is talking like that, it means that I have to take action, because
Right.
I do think that when you have a strong creative urge that is persistent, that you just do it and see what happens.
So why a
Yeah.
podcast? Because you have Beyond Solitaire, you have the blog, you have the YouTube channel, you're a contributor to Dice Tower, and you've done all these other things that I've mentioned in terms of, guest spots all over the place. Well, what is it about a podcast in particular that excited you about moving in that direction?
I think it's because I like to compartmentalize a lot of the things that I do. My channel is very much about tutorials and solo games and sometimes puzzles, but I wanted more room to kind of do what I wanted with my
Mm,
podcast. And I felt like having a podcast that is specifically my passion project, where I just do whatever I want and nobody has any particular expectations of that, was a perfect way to do it. I also think that
mm,
it's easier to get unusual guests when they're not going to be filmed. Not
mm.
everybody is a person who's used to being on camera and coming on YouTube. And hey, do you want to be on my podcast? It's just going to be like a little phone call that I record, is a much easier pitch, because a
Mm,
lot of people that I bring on my podcast are people who are not board gaming people. They're people who don't know me. Actually, my
mhm.
first interview was with a classic scholar who I saw at like a Latin convention for kids, and he gave a talk about Roman board games. Actually, I remember pitching it to you for ENGN, and you said
Yes.
you didn't know if it was a fit. And I was like, you know what? I could do my own set of interviews that are whatever I want. and I could go do it. So he
Mhm.
was my first guest.
Yeah, I mean, that's how it begins, right? It begins with so okay, why podcast? The answer I'm hearing is just conversations, right? I mean, your show Beyond Solitaire could be whatever it wants, but when you're in content, I think like whenever you develop a property, right, and it gets an audience, it's not really yours anymore. Like it's there's a contract between you and the audience, and not that the audience is the boss, so to speak, like, but there is no boss, or like it's this kind of like shared sense of responsibility. So do you feel that? Do you feel that when it comes to the Beyond Solitaire blog and the whatever else your content is, like there's an expectation that grows around that, and it makes it a little bit harder to kind of like, really radically change gears?
Yeah, I think so. People subscribe to my YouTube channel specifically for solo board game stuff. And I feel like if that's not what I'm delivering, and I even feel like puzzles are pushing it a little bit, but they're so board game adjacent that that's where I put it. I
Mhm.
actually also have a sub channel for books because I wanted to start booktubing and talking about what I was reading, but I didn't really feel that my main channel was an appropriate place for that because that's not what people subscribe to that channel for. And it
Mhm.
just felt not quite right.
Right.
So if you want to hear me talk about books, Beyond Solitaire books, I'm just a creatively restless person. I'm all over the
Right.
place.
Yeah, I mean, just to editorialize a little bit on my part, that's what happened to Every Night is Game Night. So it started off as a solo gaming podcast, and that's like we talked about solo games, and I was like, okay, that's cool. There's a lot of solo games. There's a ton of them, and there's a huge community. So I was happy with it. But then when I would like try to want to stretch beyond that, when I want to guests that would are not solo players, but I just want to talk to them because either my friends or they're interesting or whatever, I'd get a little bit of snapback, and it wouldn't be like vicious. It wouldn't be like, oh well, now I'm never going to watch this again because you have this person on. But just that I don't want that friction. Like if I do something, I want to have it embraced. Does that make sense? Like, is that kind of where you're coming at it from? As well. So like if you do something, it's like that little bit of friction, even if it isn't a big deal. It's like I don't want that to be there. Let's just like do something else so that if I do something, it's embraced.
Yeah, I want people to know the version of me that they're coming for, if that makes
Right.
sense. I mean,
You are large and contain multitudes, Liz. You are a many faceted diamond.
I'm really the same person everywhere, right? I have the same
Mhm.
ridiculous bad puns and the same ridiculous sense of humor and all of that. Like, you can't change who you are, or at least I don't bother to try.
Mhm.
But I feel like the podcast it's actually my favorite thing that I make because it
Mm.
lets me explore gaming in ways that I personally find more meaningful. So the other reason this podcast exists is because and I talk to you about this because we talk about our channels and about everything.
Yeah.
I sometimes have these sorts of feelings where I'm a little bit creatively stymied, or I feel like my channel has become work and I don't feel like doing work and it was supposed to be fun.
Mhm.
And that's something that I've really been suffering from with the YouTube channel in particular. And it's not that I don't like to make tutorials, it's that they're really a lot of work. And in order to keep up a steady schedule of them, especially as I've tended towards heavier games, that was going to take up more and more of my time. While I'm also mildly traumatized by being a teacher teaching in person in a pandemic. And
Mhm.
it's been a rough year for having the motivation to do more teaching right now, if that makes
Mhm.
sense.
I think like so we're both reflective people. That's why we get along. We are just talking about that in the green room, so to speak, before the show. And like especially in the context of this pandemic, I think that you try to use games as escapism, but if you're any bit of aware, then there's no escape. It's kind of there all the time, and it's kind of even if it isn't on our minds, it's on our energy. And like if we're playing a game and it's like your brain is elsewhere, there's nothing wrong with the game. Like we're not going to sit here and say, oh well, I think that I don't want to give that impression. I know you don't either, of like, well, this is beneath me or this is whatever. It's like, okay, it's about energy. And like sometimes our energy is not in the tutorial and not in the just a game focused content. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's absolutely fair. And I think the other actually connected that in a way is the other reason why I'm particularly attracted to doing projects for this podcast is that I feel like when we talk about board games, there's a large tendency towards board games are escapism. It's just a game, but
Right.
I am an incessant navel gazer. It's just who I am. Nothing's ever. just anything for me because it's the academic in me. I can't help it. And the
Right.
podcast gives me a way to explore, I think, some of those deeper conversations and deeper thoughts we can have about games and what they mean and what they say about us
Mhm.
and how we can examine ourselves through gaming that really, people who are coming to me because they just want a tutorial don't want.
Right. So then, yeah, exactly. Like it's all about what people want. We want to give the people what they want, but like it has to be from us. And right now, I think we're both on the same page where it's like, okay, we have other things to give, like above the table, so to speak, rather than just on the table. So
Beyond
it's
the table. Ah.
right. I mean, because I remember we talked about like because we had chatted, we chat all the time, and when you first started the podcast, and you said it like you didn't really know what you wanted to do, you just felt like you had this urge. And I definitely feel like over the 2 seasons of the podcast and seeing the guests and seeing the topics and hearing just how you're talking right now, you have definitely clarified your purpose with the podcast. So maybe, and I know you've kind of mentioned it, but like kind of let's kind of drill down on that. That okay, what is the current purpose of the podcast? What is your current intentionality behind the individual shows and the just the overall vision of what the podcast is offering?
I think that if you look at all of my episodes in aggregate, especially because they have very different topics, I'll talk to Matthew Kirschenbaum about Kriegspiel and its history, or I've talked to you about gaming and therapy, or, I've just talked to Christina Carl about how she connects her work as a sports journalist to her love of games and gaming. I think what I'm loving is that every single guest that I have that that I bring onto the podcast has something to say about games that makes me think about them more deeply,
Right.
makes me reflect on myself and others as players, makes me reflect on games as something that can make a statement and that is crafting an experience as opposed to something that I'm just doing mindlessly for fun. I think
Hmm.
the podcast is really about being mindful about games and thinking about how we can get the most out of them as opposed to treating them like, oh, it's just a pointless toy, it's just a game.
I think that yes. So like so many podcasts out there are these are the toys, and we're going to talk about the toys, and, and that's fine, that's great, and I feel like I think you as because I listening to your show kind of as it developed, you kind of developed this voice of like, okay, I am not playing with a toy. I mean, yes, I am, but there's like a mind inside the toy. And I want to talk with people who are also either making those games and putting their minds in the toy or have like smart things to say. So like at the end of the day, Beyond Solitaire is a podcast that is above the table that wants to make you think. Is that a good way of kind of summing up what your current kind of raison d'etre of the show is?
Yeah, I think it's definitely designed to make you think. And I would also say that my feelings about this definitely come from the fact that I have an academic research background. When you
Yes.
study ancient languages, people got a lot of information out of the Oxyrhynchus papyri, which were literally a trash heap that someone found in the Egyptian desert full of discarded things and receipts. Important documents have been found on papyrus that was reused to wrap mummies. Things that are discarded or that you don't think that much about necessarily can actually contain some of the most important bits of
Mm-hmm.
evidence, insights about a life, about a time period. And so I think I'm just incessantly looking for that.
Mm-hmm. All right. So then, let's get into just some of the individual episodes, and just some of your favorites, so to speak. So, like, kind of reflecting, when you do a podcast for a while, there certain shows or certain ideas or certain guests kind of stick out, and we love everybody. They're all our children. We love every single episode. We don't want to choose among them, but I guess I was curious as to, what were some moments that you remember where it's almost like you feel like ding, level up, or like, okay, I figured something else out that I want to do now, or something that just sticks out. It's like, wow, I really learned something. So I'm putting you on the spot a little bit about that, but maybe you can kind of go sequentially, like looking at, the, high points of your show and kind of go from there. So like maybe so I'll ask it this way. What was kind of the first high point where you either learned something or it really stuck with you about, what you were doing and I was like, wow, I really did something there.
So I will say that my favorite thing about my podcast is that I always have a great conversation with whoever's on it, and I've made
Of
so
course.
many friends through it actually that it's been life changing just in that respect. But I think there was a pivotal moment in the first season. I think it's like the maybe the sixth episode
Hmm.
um, with Caitlin Leong. So she just wrote. She's a master's student at Georgetown who is brilliant, by the way. And she wrote this piece that I saw in Pack Sims about professional wargaming and getting more women into it. And I didn't know that professional wargaming was really a thing. I never thought about it. And I
Mm.
was like, I must interview this person. This is just so cool. So I just reached out to her. And fortunately, she responded and agreed to come on the show. We had a delightful conversation. But it also changed the fabric of my podcast because I thought, oh, I'll just interview this one person who's into professional wargaming and to see what happens next. But
Hmm.
instead, I ended up making internet friends with a bunch of professional wargamers who I now talk to and discuss games with all the time.
Hmm.
And it got me, invited to wargaming Facebook groups where I made more friends. And I would say that something about that episode, because it caught an audience that I wasn't expecting, and I don't think they were expecting me either. It really changed the way that I view games, the kinds
Hmm.
of people that I could imagine talking to about games, and I not only just really enjoyed that interview with Caitlin in itself, but talking to her opened up my entire world as somebody talking about play with other people, and it was just really something.
Mm. And I think you got connected with the Zenobia people through that, right?
Yeah, actually, I got connected to Zenobia because I'd already talked to Harold for his podcast, and then I interviewed Volko and his son Andrew about Falling Sky.
Who are these people?
So, okay, so Volko is very fancy and famous in Wargame Land because he is the kind of main coin series person
Okay.
who also cultivates other designers to create coin games. He's also a former CIA, and I don't want to make him
Mm.
mad. No kidding. He's really nice. He's a really nice guy.
You don't want to get on that list. No.
No, only the good list. Only the good list. No, Vodka's great. Um, but because I talked to him and Harold, and they are really the minds behind Zenobia, they then knew me as somebody that they would pull in. One thing that both of those guys are great at doing is finding people who might fit a community and pulling them in.
Hmm.
So they've both kind of pulled me along since I got to know them, and I'm really grateful for that.
Hmm.
The wargaming community among like designers and pro wargamers who also talk to designers, it's really a beautiful thing. Something I think is underappreciated. I was gonna say I also really loved. So there's a lot of I love talking to teachers. So I've talked to my former high school teacher who can get kids to play GMT games in AP Euro, which is amazing.
Right.
And I love talking to Christiane Hinz, who I did meet through Zenobia, about her world history class that is taught entirely through gaming.
Mm.
Just whoa. I've just ended up finding people who are doing things with games that are really meaningful, really
Hmm.
interesting.
So I think so you didn't know what it was at the start, and then as you do it, you just kind of like coalesce into ideas, right? And I think like some of the ideas are definitely wargaming, definitely teaching, definitely kind of the academic side, like the arguments that games make and the ideas that are put forward. Because you do a lot of wargaming, so it's like there's ideas in that, or like just games that feature some kind of like historical component, like El Lisboa or a historical Euro or something. Like they're all every single game comes from a perspective, and every single game makes an argument. So and it's been exciting to kind of see buckets. So like an episode will come on, and I'll say, oh, that's in this bucket today. Not that they don't cross, but it's nice to kind of have a again, you get that merge. You feel connected to a thing, and then it's like, okay, this is the part of Liz that I'm getting today. So um I guess like I don't want to ask what your favorite is, um, but I am curious. Is there a kind of a fire in the belly thing that happens? Like, is there one part of that, like the teaching thing or the historical thing that like it's like, oh wow, I'm gonna really get to this. Like with me, it's mental health. Like anytime I can do mental health, it's very exciting. In a deeper way, right? So then, for you, is there one bucket of concepts that just really like lights your fire in the belly and says, okay, this is something that I'm really really looking forward to. I really want to do.
Oh yeah, the thing that makes me the wildest is talking about gaming as a historical argument. I think one of the reasons I've
Yeah.
gravitated, I'm an omni gamer in practice, but I like to talk about and I like to cover games that have kind of a meatier thematic element to them. So war games, historical games, games that are meant to evoke something from a historical period, because I feel like they give me the most to grab onto and
Right.
then kind of analyze later. So I actually this so recently I this is earlier in February. It's episode 35. I got Megan Norcha, who is a professor, to talk to me about Gaming Empire, and I have been trying to get this woman to come on my podcast for over a year because she wrote this book called Gaming Empire where she literally analyzed gaming for children in the British Empire and how it
Yeah.
shaped
Right.
them.
Good episode.
But
Hmm.
to me, I think that everything that we play is shaping us in some way that we may or may not be conscious of.
Hmm.
And looking at historical games and their arguments is the easiest way to kind of lay that bare for
Hmm.
me and give me insights about that. I think that every game that you play is telling you something, and it says something about our culture, about us,
Hmm.
but it's just easier to see when it's about something like a war or a historical period,
Hmm.
or something that you can really actually research and grab onto.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember the episode. So I do have a personal favorite, the episode you did with Cole Worley about the historical arguments, and he's like a super reflective guy. I mean, I think does he have a doctorate?
Yes, yeah, he and I are both post-doc, which is one of the reasons I love talking to him.
It's not only all the content; it's like, oh man, what about this part of the thing? I can't believe, you kind of talk a little bit of shop, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, it's the other thing that's really nice about this particular podcast is that talking to professors, talking to people who think about history in similar ways to me means that I'm finding people that I have a common language with and a common set of interests with, and it's really personally fulfilling, especially in a time when it's hard to socialize.
Hmm.
I mean, emotionally, this podcast does a lot for me because I'm making connections with people who are really interesting, and it reminds me how wide and amazing the world is, even if I'm spending most of the time in my apartment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's because that's also a context on, like, I distinctly remember the pace of the episodes increasing just a bit when the pandemic hit and throughout 2020. So is that also a impetus as to why the podcast seems to be, kind of really churning stuff out?
No, actually, this started in May of last year. So we were already into the pandemic, and I was teaching from home, and I was like, "This is a perfect time if there's ever a perfect time to start a new project." What I actually have been doing is I think of my podcast in 20 episode seasons. So this very episode is the end of season 2. Then I'm
Hmm.
going to take a break, and I'm going to think through what kinds of people I would like to interview and get them lined up for season 3. There's two reasons for that. One is, as you know, being somebody who's trying to release content on a regular basis can be really, really stressful, especially if you get
Sure.
behind and you feel like there are deadlines to hit. And I never want to feel that way about this podcast
Hmm.
ever. I want to always love this podcast as much as I do now because I really, really love it. The other reason is that I try to be very thoughtful about the interviews that I choose to do and the guests that I choose to have. I
Hmm. You have I don't know where you get these people. I honestly, I feel like I interview the same 15 people all the time on my show. And you're like, reaching out and getting some like, rural games teacher in Nepal, or is like, who are these people? I want them to show on my show.
But the other reason I'm doing this is that I this is actually one of the reasons my channel output has changed and kind of slowed over time is that I really believe in trying to create things that have enduring value. I would like
Right.
for people to be able to discover my podcast in 5 years, in 10 years, and still be able to get something out of it, which is why you'll rarely hear me talking about, just doing a bunch of banter or like something that's really recent.
Like, yeah,
Um,
the latest and greatest. Here's the hotness, and like there's no hotness. Like Beyond Solitaire is hotness proof.
but there are other people who are doing that better than me anyway, and that's not really where my interest lies. And the other reason I've started to focus, think about the videos I make too. I make reviews, I make tutorials. I'm trying to make things that still have utility
Hmm.
after some time And I come to my podcast with that same approach. And so I make myself stop. Like, there are more people I could interview to make a longer season for the season, but I'd rather just wait for season 3 so that I have a cohesive set of episodes that are meaningful, and it doesn't look like I ever just went for filler,
Mhm.
because I don't ever want anything on this particular podcast to be a throwaway episode, a filler episode, something that I made to fill time. I actually despise the term content because it just sounds like cheese
Mm.
food, something that fills time. Like,
Pasteurized processed content. That's what we do.
and I want to make something that is meaningful and that has use. Actually, it makes me think about, my dissertation advisor. With, he and I have an abiding love-hate relationship. It was some of the best moments of my life have been with him, and some of the worst. But he gave good advice. And one of the things he always told me was that scholarship is temporary. In 30 years, somebody's going to just challenge whatever you said, and the conversation will move on without you. The only way for a person's work to last is for it to be so useful that nobody replicates it.
Mm.
And so, be useful is something that I thought of when I was writing my dissertation, when I was thinking of things to write. One of the reasons I left academia is because I don't like to create filler. And
Mhm.
I felt like I had to come up with something to say instead of the thing to say.
Yeah, so if people don't know, just that there's a publisher parish, we call it. So, when you become an academic, you have to publish in journals, and it doesn't matter. Like, it really, like, I mean, it does. You have to get accepted, but like, as long as you're publishing and as long as your CV like grows in length, I really do feel like in order to get tenure, some people like kind of measure your CV in inches rather than like in content. And it's just like it's the academic version of content.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm a chatterbox in regular off hours life. I love to talk to people, and I totally waste time talking all the time, to probably to some people's dismay. But when it comes to publishing,
Liz, enough. I'm good. I'm good.
but when it comes to what you're putting out there, right? What you're creating, I feel like everything that you create says something about you. And it is important to me to make things that have some sort of value, that have some sort of meaning, because to me, that means that I have value and that I have meaning, even if that's not necessarily accurate as a perception.
Have you ever gotten any kind of pushback from that? Have you ever gotten the it's just the game pushback? Like, let's focus on like why we're here type stuff, and like all that stuff is great. And you're having all these conversations. And I find that people especially get that way when issues of representation come up, because now people feel threatened. Now people are like, oh, well, what am I? I'm not a bad person. I'm not this, that, and their thing. I'm just trying to enjoy my game over here. So like you have done episodes that about, female representation. And I think you had one episode of like, gaming for the blind or something like that. And so have you ever gotten any of that kind of pushback, or is it just like you've established enough guardrails early to kind of avoid most of that?
I think the answer is kind of. So people generally eat up my more purely historical episodes. My episode with Cole Worley is actually one that people have listened to the most so far, and that got a
Hmm.
huge number of downloads. I was sort of surprised. Um,
You were
but
surprised? That episode was amazing. I
yeah,
listened
but I
to it.
mean,
I listened to it multiple times. That thing was great.
but what's really interesting is that people never complain to me about my podcast, and people never seem to have a problem with my podcast. But I do tend to get dislikes on the episodes that are about more politicized issues, such as
Yeah.
inclusion, such as
Hmm.
women in gaming. And it's very interesting also that, my I did an episode with Rex Brennan where he had gamed out the election,
Hmm.
and they had already known that there was going to be some very questionable stuff happening in American politics, and we talked very frankly about that. That episode got more than the usual number of dislikes. So
Hmm.
basically, if people don't like what I'm saying, they get cranky about it and hit the dislike button. But fortunately, at this point, I have not gotten any like mean emails or anything. I've
Okay.
gotten the occasional comment that I've had to delete, but it's pretty rare. I'm so far, knock on wood, pleased with the fact that people who don't like what I have to say either hit the dislike button and leave, or just aren't saying anything at all. I
Right.
mean, it's not that I don't want to have an intelligent conversation, but that's not actually possible on Twitter or in a YouTube comment thread.
Sure.
So, there you go.
Okay. I mean, some. You I mean, it depends on. So I think that you are a person that if as long as you engage the content, you'll engage them. right? As long as even if they disagree with you, as long as they're engaging in good faith in whatever the platform is, I think that you will try your best. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm a teacher. I have to teach
Right.
everyone who comes to my room, no matter what their beliefs are at home, no matter what their parents are telling them, and like there are things I don't permit in my classroom, such as being mean to each other, saying intolerant things that hurt other kids' feelings. Generally, you have to be a decent person who's decent to other people in my classroom. Beyond that, it's not my duty to tell you how to be in the world, only to show you how to think well about things. And
Mm.
that is the attitude that I have in my podcast. I try to let my guests say what they're going to say and not interfere too much. There have been things that are said that I was like, "Ooh," but
Ooh,
I let
okay.
it
I'm
go.
curious about that. I don't know if you want to go there, but you've scintillated my curiosity. Ooh.
Oh no, I mean the people who are talking about social issues, I by and large feel comfortable with that I've had on so far. I
Mm,
will say, Falco, I love you. I have so many questions about basing a game super hard on a source by just Julius Caesar when he committed lots of genocide, and we don't really know about his opponents except through him.
mm,
So, as a Roman historian, I have many more questions about Falling Sky. But as an interviewer, I was not about to like start
sure.
something with Valko and Andrew, who did a perfectly good job with their game and paid
Hmm.
attention to the sources they used. It's just that from a historian perspective, professionally working in that field, I have concerns.
Because we had the same issue when it came to Commissioned, which is the Christian board game about the spread of Christianity in the early period. And it's very much from kind of an inside out perspective of, here's how the scriptures developed. There were only X amount of books, and, it was a process like finding them. And, there's no real resistance in getting getting converts and everything. And that game is making an historical argument as well, and it's like, okay, you know,
It's also a historical argument where the texts are dated wrong and where you are assuming the correct outcome.
right.
Like, it's that game is not for me because it's pushing a narrative that I think is very simplified in favor of a worldview that I do not agree with.
And so, like, I mean, I think we can kind of I don't want to get down too in the weed because this is about you and your podcast, but it is worth kind of framing, right? That don't all games do that. Like, don't games have to do that? Especially because and there's also different audiences for games, right? So then, a game like Commissioned is not for historically, sophisticated folks. Like, it's a simple game meant for, simple situations, families, and all that kind of thing. Even like some Waro games, like, are not necessarily for people who know, who dive into the different historical arguments. Like, can a game be complicated and still be a fun game? Can a game contain multiple historical arguments that may even contradict one another? Is that what our games, like, again, like, I know we both resist the idea of it's just a game, but there are frameworks and there are boundaries there. And what do you think of that?
Absolutely. Well, that's why this podcast exists. It's because every game you have to make certain assumptions, even within the rules of that game. You have to choose what options you're going
Right.
to offer your players, which also reflect your bias and your take on a situation. And what you're offering is being offered typically to people who are not historical experts, and very frequently, neither are the designers. And that's not necessarily a problem, but it is a cause for reflection.
Mhm.
And being aware, I think, is more important than making sure that everything is absolutely correct, if that makes sense.
Right.
It's more about being alert to, what impact is this game having on me? What am I being asked to do in this game?
Hmm.
Is this something that is just, can I just dismiss this as an exercise that was amusing? If I play this enough times, what will I see and what will I feel? And I think that just talking about it, just thinking about it raises your awareness in a way that makes you able to have, I think, a deeper experience of playing games because your eyes are open to its larger possibilities.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's what this. I like how you said that. Like, that's what this podcast is all about. This is about framing the arguments. It's about having those discussions. And yeah, I mean, it's hard to kind of like totally hide behind the screen. I think that, I caught this myself as well, where, it's hard to kind of just take that completely professorial role. Like, I do think we both of us have skin in the game, so to speak. Like I think there are worse and better arguments. And like I think you do a decent job of like kind of stepping back every once in a while. But there have been times where it's like, oh, okay, Liz is okay, Liz is coming down somewhere. Um, are you aware of that? And are there times that stick out in your mind where that's happened, where it's like, okay, there's a professorial aspect that I need to take, but then there's I'm on a side here, and I want to try to navigate how do I express my opinion.
I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with being on a side because everyone's on a side. Um, I think that my job as the interviewer is to occasionally push. And actually, one of the reasons I wanted to have this episode is because you can generally tell what I think by the questions I ask, but it's not
Right,
explicit. And
right.
I think that there is value in being pushed to be explicit about where you're coming from and what you're thinking because it's misleading to pretend that, oh, it's just an accident. I'm a perfectly objective interviewer because no one is that. And
Right.
so knowing things about me and where I come from, I think might make my podcast more understandable
Mhm.
and more something that people can appreciate or not based on what they know about me. I mean, think about, when you read a piece of classic literature, not that I'm that at all. Oh my God, no. But you read about the author because
What, you're not turning Homer's Iliad around in your sleep? You don't have one under your pillow?
I mean, I have a copy of the Odyssey sitting like 3 feet away, but that's because I'm a Latin teacher.
Yeah. Yeah, I avoided the Latin one. I'm wondering if the other classics call to you. Probably not.
Actually, yeah. I mean, I'm rereading Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man right now in preparation for reading James Joyce's Ulysses.
Oh, you are insane. Oh, please.
Yes, I mean, yeah, but people who are listening to my podcast should probably know that, you know, because, knowing a person's interests and knowing a person's leanings and knowing that they know that, I think makes it easier to process what they're saying. I
Mhm.
think that sometimes being too quiet about where you're coming from just leaves the door open for people to make assumptions about you that are bound to not be fair.
Right.
I like to think that I give other people a fair shot, and
Sure.
I want to be given a fair shot, and I think it's important to be clear with myself about what I'm doing and what my project is so that I can also be clear with others.
All right. Okay. So we did have a listener question, and I would be remiss if I didn't at least address. So this is from a listener, Corey Mayo. Hi, Corey. From the great state of Texas.
It is a
My
great state.
brother.
That's where I'm from too.
There you go. Got a lot of love for the Texans over there. So you do have a podcast, right? And I think that's gotten a lot of your energy. But I think he noticed a trend of at least in your other content, a little bit more camera facing work. Like everything when you first debuted, it was a lot of like kind of camera at the table, Ricky Royal style. And then as things have gone on, it's been a little bit more kind of on camera, more of a personal face, personal voice coming out. Are you aware of making that shift? And if so, what do you think about that?
I actually don't feel that it's a shift. If you look at my very, very earliest videos, I actually was more. You had parts with my face, and I experimented with being funny and doing skits and stuff like that. And then I realized that I didn't like it because everything that I do is actually about being to the point. If you put me on your show to have a chat, then I'm just going to chat with you because I'm naturally a chatterbox. But my playthroughs are very bare bones because I want that. I think that people just want me to get down to business, do the business, and leave them alone. I think that in a review, which is where you're going to see my face, I think it's actually very important to see my face when I'm reviewing something because I think that that gives you the authenticity and emotion and nuance that you need to interpret what I'm saying. In some ways, I like doing video reviews better than written ones, not because I don't like to write, which I do. I'm still rethinking how I want to handle my blog, which I haven't updated in a while.
Mhm.
But I like being able to give criticism about a game, but with facial expressions and a tone of voice that can, I think, reveal more about how I'm really feeling. I tend
Right.
to record reviews that are where my opinions are fairly fresh.
Mhm.
And so I think that when you see my face, there's a reason for it. And that
Mhm.
reason is, it's related to the purpose of what I'm doing.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's funny because I remember I getting that question. I'm talking about a podcast. It's like okay, but you answered that question before, where you said a lot of the podcast conversations is about the guest, right? And what the
Yeah.
guest is comfortable with. And a lot of times the guest might be comfortable on the phone. Like I actually have in my own therapy, I have clients who are more comfortable on the phone. They're like, get this video out of here. Like I think better and I can access more of my feelings when I'm not looking at something and when I'm not, I could just talk. Right. So,
Yeah.
and I imagine you're having you've been reflecting about kind of navigating, video and, audio and, stills and the different ways in which you kind of like engage with people.
Yeah, a lot of the people that I interview, my former high school teacher, a professor, sometimes I'm somebody's very first podcast.
Right.
And I feel like giving them the feeling that they're just talking to me on the phone is the most relaxing way to interact with me because they don't have to worry about how they look. I mean, everybody who's been in a Zoom meeting knows you're constantly worried about how stupid or not you look when you're in the frame. Um, it's
Right.
distracting. And I like to strip things down to get what people are thinking out of them
Mhm.
instead of have them being distracted by how they might be perceived by others. And I want to eliminate as much of that paranoia as possible because I
Mhm.
also think that the very best interviews and the very best conversations have a rawness to them that is impeded by thinking about how people will perceive it later.
Mm. Okay. Well, that's a lot of the questions that I had. Did you have any additional reflections about the podcast that you wanted to make sure that we got into the body of the episode before we get into kind of the future thinking?
Yeah, I think just reflecting on this conversation is one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation. I think that you reflect on yourself through being forced to put what you're doing and who you are into words.
Right.
And I think what this podcast has done for me is it's been personally great for me in terms of making connections, but I also do think that it reveals a lot about where I stand on issues of inclusion, on political issues, on,
Hmm.
historical interpretation, things that you might not have known about me from just watching my playthroughs come out in my podcast even if I'm not the one who's talking.
Hmm.
And it's been really interesting to think about what my podcast says about me as much as what it says about games or about other people. You're always telling multiple stories when you make something, you know?
Yeah, I think like I like what you said there about like forming thinking. I think there's this idea that like I'm listening to somebody, they have ideas, and they're turning on the camera and sharing their ideas, or they're turning on the microphone and sharing ideas. And maybe I don't. Maybe I have like the seed of an idea, and it's the act of making the content that is me watering that seed and growing it up and cultivating it into something that's a little bit more you know okay, that's what I'm thinking, as opposed to kind of where I was before. I'm not making the content, I'm just thinking, and it's just kind of a jumble. So, in a way, the act of making content is not just presenting thoughts, but it's actually cultivating our own thoughts at the time. Like, there's this reflective episode, obviously, that helps in that process. But even in every individual episode, it's like, wow, like not only did I present an idea, I clarified my own thinking so that when I'm talking, making a comment, or responding to somebody's comment or something like that, like my thought is now more clarified and my conviction is a little bit more kind of like attuned because of the content and engaging in that content creation process. I know you hate the word content, but I don't have another word.
I know it's a word I use media a lot, but content's the default. So
It's the default. So like I actually absolutely agree with you. I do not want to make content. I do not want to waste filler. That's what content means to me, is filler. I don't make filler, neither do you. But it's just a word. But anyway, like, so I mean, I'm guessing you were on the same page with that, where it's in the process of creating that piece that we actually kind of move the ball forward on our own thinking, and that's another thing that you kind of get out of the podcast.
yeah, I think that you make things because they benefit you as much as you think about them benefiting other people.
Right. And not just benefit us like in views or clicks or like,
No,
it's
as a
it benefits us in our growth, in our own growth.
definitely.
All right. So let us look at the future. So we are, so that is Beyond Solitaire. It's a podcast that makes you think. And it's a podcast that wants to go above the table and be historically critical and bring in issues of inclusion and all the things that Liz does. And I think that, this was a really great pause to kind of consider everything that's happened, how it's grown from that first idea where it was very inchoate, but now it's like, okay, it's pretty formed at this point. So then we're closing the book in season 2. We're looking forward to season 3. You mentioned before that you wanted to take a little bit of time to reflect on, kind of like, okay, who do I want on? But do you have some ideas? Do you have some future directions, maybe either enhancing what's already been done or opening up some new frontiers for you? So maybe let the listeners in on a little bit of thoughts about that.
Yeah, so what's really, maybe this is a bad idea about my podcast, is that I'll probably plan out 5 or 10 interviews that I'd like to do, and
Mhm.
then the rest will just happen naturally, and I have to trust that that's gonna happen, because as I discover people and read things, I get ideas, and
Right.
then I just start contacting people, and I see what happens.
That is absolutely how it works. If there's a Twitter thing that blows up, then or like, some idea that happens, it's like, okay, that gave me a thought. I'm going to jump on it. So much of content just happens like reactively that way, and that's a good thing.
Oh, yeah, but if I read an article, I've started actually, this has been interesting because it's put me a lot more in touch with my academic self. I've been reading a lot more game study stuff again,
Mhm.
and I think there are a lot of people doing a lot of interesting work that are out there to talk to. I because the Zenobia award is happening, I would very much like to interview some of the people who are creating games in the later stages and talking to them about their thought process and the viewpoints that they're bringing to wargaming. I actually would like to have maybe another voice on here that is more conservative. I know that
Mhm.
we are in a culture right now where we have a hard time giving airtime to views that we don't agree with and that some people might find harmful depending on who I talk to. But I think that there is value in talking to people who are different from me and
Mhm.
that it can be done without a fight. So I think that, I'm looking for the right person to have that dialogue with.
I can think of a million people, but they're not the right people.
Right. Because I'm picky. My podcast episodes have to have actual value. It's not, I don't do things just to do them.
Sure.
And so, I'm willing to have ideas and cut them because I don't think that they work. I'm willing to have something appear and embrace it because I think it does.
Mhm.
And, so those are things that are on my mind, but I'm just going to take as much break as I need to, knowing perfectly well that season 3 is going to happen. Probably start recording it before it starts to run
Mhm.
and then just sit back and let it flow.
Yeah, so you don't have any well, besides having like a different viewpoint, it's going to be more of the Beyond Solitaire that we've come to love. Like it's going to be more Cole Worley, it's going to be more Megan Norcia, it's going to be like those kind of voices.
Yeah, although actually, I want to have Marco Arnaudo on again. Marco Wargamer, now Marco Omnigamer, because he makes really interesting games about Cthulhu and is
Mm.
very into Lovecraft's actual work, is very knowledgeable about it. I need to finish my reread of Lovecraft so that I can have him on and have an in-depth talk about how he relates to literature that people find problematic, how he subverts it through his games. I'm always looking for something interesting because the thing is that I'm an endlessly curious person, so I love things that I have to do research for too, and like topics that are interesting me in the moment.
Mhm.
And so I'm always looking for something that's going to make me grow too, because stagnation is basically death. So, I mean, you could say more Cole Worley, but if I have Cole on here again, it'll be because I have something that I want to talk about with him, not
Right,
just
right.
because he's Cole Worley. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
He was
Yeah, no, no,
delightful,
that
and I was
totally
glad
makes sense.
to
Like,
see
I guess I not that I meant like the specific people, but like those types of conversations.
yeah,
Like, if you enjoyed those episodes, you are going to get more of those episodes with different people on different topics, but kind of within the realms that you've established over the course
definitely.
of 2 seasons.
Yeah, I think there's still a lot to mine there. I think that there are not. I can't think of any other podcasts that are quite like this one, and so I'm just gonna keep letting it be my quirky, side passion project for as long as it
Mhm.
makes me happy, which so far looks to be for a long time.
Absolutely. So, I am not good. I am not going to even attempt the way that you close the show. So I'm going to now we're going to stand up. I am going to leave the desk. You are going to leave the couch. We're going to switch places again, and I'm going to hand the reins back to you, Liz, so that we can close the show the proper way.
Absolutely, Jason. Thank you so much for doing this. I hope that you did not mind giving up this time on your beautiful Sunday morning to humor me. I hope.
I like your navel. Let me gaze at that navel for 45 minutes.
And you know what? I hope that this episode had actual, again, utility for the people who listen to this podcast and that it was helpful in some way because
I mean,
that's
it's a good process episode. I mean, like people, like not everybody, but like I think a lot of people love just process stuff. It's like it's like a making of type thing. It's like 19 episodes of a show, and then for the 20th episode, we're going behind the scenes, and people watch that. Like people collect DVDs all the time. So like this is like if we're collecting the Beyond Solitaire DVD collection, this is the
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 laser disc
director's
collection.
edition or something.
Let's go further. So, as I like to end things, Jason, where can we find you online?
So if you like my interview style and some of the thoughts that I have, and you are maybe this is the first or second time you're getting to know me and the way I present content, I am a content creator. Content. Anyway, uh, my channel is Shelf Stories. It's a YouTube channel where I engage in not the same conversations as Liz, because if you get me to play a war game, I may just like drop dead right there. Because I haven't been able to do it, Liz. I'm sorry. It's not working for me.
It's okay.
Maybe
Perfection isn't for everyone.
maybe I need you to just because you live in Atlanta, I live in Connecticut, so like we need to kind of shrink that distance a little bit so you can open up that world for me. So no wargaming content for me. However, history, historical arguments. I'm a mental health therapist, so I have mental health show episodes that I do called Shelf Help. I've been doing a lot with culture in my Good Trouble series. So these are video conversations. So that's just something I get a lot more out of the video. And maybe at some point, Liz, you can do the same thing for me, and I'll talk about what Shelf Stories is all about. So that'll be cool. I'm also a reviewer on the Dice Tower. That's where I get my fun gaming content, and also a playthrough person and podcaster on the One Stop Co-op Shop. So I am a lot of places. Shelf Stories GBL on the Twitter. User Pope Sixtus on BGG. I'm very. I will talk to you. Like I'm not quite the chatterbox Liz is, but I will respond, and I do like to engage. So that is Jason from Shelf Stories and Liz's bestie. So hopefully this will not be the last time I'm on the show.
God, I hope not. So I will be putting information for Jason in the notes of this show. As usual, you can find me anywhere on the internet as Beyond Solitaire. Happy gaming, everybody.
Later, everybody.